Alright, this video will focus on Chapter 31, the Americas, basically the entire Western Hemisphere in the Age of Independence. Ignore that stuff, that's just... Okay, so, Western expansion of the United States. After the Revolutionary War, Britain gives America territories between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. This doubles the country. Napoleon Bonaparte sells the Louisiana Territory to finance his war in 1803, and this doubles the country again. You have the Lewis and Clark expedition mapping the territory, and this helps prompt a sense of, you must go west and manifest destiny to occupy all lands between the Atlantic and Pacific. Example of this would be John Guest's American Progress, 1872. So the War of 1812 involves a U.S. invasion of Canada failing, and someone called this the first civil war between Anglo-Americans. So the Native Americans resist incursions onto ancestral lands and traditional hunting grounds. They try to form alliances with other powers to form alliances, as well as seeking British support in Canada, but they fail, as they are the clear losers of the War of 1812. The U.S. Indian Removal Act of 1830 pushed the natives into Indian territory. This is where you get the tragic trail of tears of thousands dying en route. You also get the Opium War in 1849, so things are pretty terrible if you're a non-European elsewhere. So the Sioux, Comanche, Pawnee, and Apache peoples use horses and guns to attempt to resist the federal government. They see some minor successes initially. For example, in 1876, the Battle of Little Bighorn. But eventually, the U.S. forces are able to overpower the Native Americans as they have superior firepower, including cannons and a Gatling machine gun. You get cases like 1890 with the massacre at Wounded Knee Creek, where nervous U.S. cavalry slaughter men, women, and children, basically a form of genocide or ethnic cleansing. Mexico previously included Texas, California, New Mexico, and etc. Texas, under the influence by many U.S. slave-owning settlers, declares independence from Mexico in 1846 and is accepted into the Union in 1845 despite Mexican protests. Conflict quickly erupts, with Mexico forced to cede territory in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in exchange for $15 million. So that's a map of U.S. expansionism westward. Now, there's a major issue over slavery. Specifically, should it be allowed in the new territories or not? Tobacco cultivation was in decline, but cotton industry spurs new demand for slaves. The U.S. slave population rises from 500,000 in 1770 to 2 million in 1820. The Missouri Compromise in 1820 attempts to strike balance between slave and free states. Abraham Lincoln, of course, these compromises don't work, eventually blowing up the full-blown Civil War. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected president. He's committed to an anti-slavery position. This issue highlighted the issue of states' rights versus federal authority as well, concerning the matter of slavery. 11 southern states withdraw from the Union from 1860 to 1861. The southern economy was dependent on cotton as a cash crop, whereas the northern economy was dependent on industry and factory workers. The first 2 years of the war is inconclusive. In 1863, Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation in order to make abolition of slavery the explicit goal of the war and to keep European powers out of the war. The Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 turns the tide against the South. The North wins after 4 years of bloody conflict with 675,000 American deaths. So, reflections of the U.S. up to 1865. This was an enlightened experiment. It was basically an experiment with the Enlightenment, but you also get the overt racism, bigotry, and genocide, as we've seen before. Also, nuts and panics about banks and bimetallism, Gettysburg Revolution, rising nationalism, industrialization, Pax Britannica, and the U.S. possibly being a gunpowder empire. Basically, everywhere is war. So, there are divisions within Canadian society, but for the most part, independence is achieved without a brutal war. The British and the French Canadians are largely held together largely because of the fear of the Americans. French territories were gobbled up by the British after the 7 Years' War. Now, large concessions were made to the large French population with the recognition of the Roman Catholic Church and the French law code. After 1781, the British population in Ontario is joined by loyalists fleeing the U.S. War of Independence. The U.S. declares war on Britain over encroachments during the Napoleonic War, specifically impressment of sailors. British forces in Canada repel U.S. attacks. Social tensions between the French and English populations still remain, but the threat of a U.S. invasion helps keeps them unified. British, in order to avoid a repeat of the U.S. War of Independence, gradually extend home rule between 1840 and 1867, spurned by the enlightened Durham Report. Of course, you also get this the same time as the Opium War. So not exactly not exact. So if you're a white person, if you're British, you treat basically what you're doing is you're treating other Europeans very enlightened with enlightened policies, and non-Europeans with terrible unenlightened policies. So the British North America Act combines Quebec, Ontario, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick as a dominion of Canada, with other provinces joining later. This creates provincial and federal governments with a governor general as the British representative, the dominion controlling all domestic affairs, with foreign affairs being controlled after 1931. The first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, purchased the Northwest Territory and built the Trans-Canadian Railroad. So this is a nice, map of the expansion of Canada. So the Creole elites produced republics with constitutions, but they have less experience with self-rule due to the fact that the Spanish and Portuguese were more autocratic. The Creoles limit white participation in politics. You also get significant political differences that divide the Creoles. They conflict with the indigenous peoples. In this chaos, you have the chaotic and weak nature of Latin American republics leads to the rise of caudillos, or regional military leaders. They were charismatic, macho, Machiavellian, and brutal. Example being Rosas of Argentina. After the U.S.-Mexican War, Benito Juarez comes to power in an attempt to reform Mexico. He attempts to limit the power of the military and the church, but he meets powerful conservative opposition being forced out of Mexico City. In his attempt to suspend loan payments to foreign powers, but this pisses off the Europeans who intervene. French and Mexican forces clash in 1862 on the 5th of May. This is where the Cinco de Mayo comes from. Despite the Mexican victory, the French puppet Emperor Maximilian is still able to rule. This was basically a flagrant violation of the Monroe Doctrine, but the Americans couldn't do anything about it because, remember, 1862, they were in the middle of a bloody civil war. Of course, great tensions remain with Mexican society, and this all comes to the head of the Mexican Revolution. Middle-class Mexican peasants and workers joined to overthrow dictator Porfirio Diaz. Revolutionary leaders Zapata y Pancho Villa lead masses of landless peasants. They are popular but unable to take major cities. The Mexican Constitution in 1917 addresses many of the major concerns of land redistribution, but implementation is still going on. 2 million die in one of the big four revolutions of the 20th century. So, the economic development of the Americas depends on mass migration and British investment. Californian and Canadian gold rushes attract migrants, with others migrating to factories, railroad construction sites, plantations, and support services. You also get some cases in Latin America, with especially Italians. They migrate and return several times and thus their term swallows. Indentured servants replace slaves, especially in Brazil. However, most ex-slaves end up in debt peonage and sharecropping. So, British capital spurs vast expansion of the U.S. industry, but the Americans are still able to maintain control. A massive expansion of the rail system, 31,000 miles in 1860 to 200,000 miles by 1900, coast to coast. This necessitates the division of the U.S. into 4 time zones. You also got massive expansion of the economy with electrification, phones, photography, etc. Trade unions struggle for a voice but generally lose. There's a huge British investment in Canada too, with Britain paying high prices for raw materials in order to keep Canada happy. After 1867, you got a policy of economic development, the national policy, attracting migrants, promoting startup industries, implementing tariffs, and building transportation infrastructure. The U.S. also invested in Canada and end up eventually owning 40% of Canadian industry by 1918. Canada's still upset about that, and that's why Canada tries very aggressively to prevent U.S. dominance in the Canadian economy. Spain and Portugal were not industrialized, so Latin America became dependent on the UK, US, French, and German industry. Nascent local industry is snuffed out, and the narrow-minded local elites were bought off. This helps basically just neo-colonize. This basically just leads to the neo-colonialism / economic imperialism of Latin America. Countries like examples include the United Fruit Company of the United States. The investors are interested in exploiting copper and beef, but not much industrialization. Mexico tried really hard to industrialize, but it was all for the oligarchs. You get significant export and immigrant-driven rise in economy, but as banana republics. The indigenous peoples were subject to a foreign policy of forced assimilation. The Dawes Severalty Act of 1887 basically eliminate the whole idea of tribal reservations. Native children were taken from families and enrolled in white and controlled boarding schools. This obviously is a very dark chapter in American history. Slavery is ended, but social discrimination remains. No surprises there. They were free slaves were falsely promised 40 acres and a mule. Northern armies occupied the southern states, forcing the social program of Reconstruction, but this doesn't work as you get a violent white backlash following the departure. It's the so-called redemption governments. Land-poor free slaves are forced to work as sharecroppers, and the violence and intimidation continue. So basically the South won the Civil War in the end. Then, of course, there's the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So, yeah, not great. There's a continued social tension between the Anglophones and the Francophone Catholics, and as well as the First Nations, or the indigenous tribes. You get a small population of slaves before slavery was abolished in 1843, freed slaves, runaways, and Chinese migrants. Louis Riel leads a native and Métis rebellion in Western Canada. He was crushed and executed, as, railroads preferred over fur. You get massive immigration from the UK, US, and Eastern Europe between 1896 and 1914. In Latin America, you have a complex social structure based on racial background. Europeans, natives, African slaves, there's combinations thereof, for example, castizo, which is basically 3/4 white. Increasing migration in the 19th century, you have increasing migration in the 19th century from both Europe and Asia. However, there's some conflict between the cosmopolitan cities and backward rural areas. An example, a symbol of egalitarian rural culture would be the gacho or vaqueros cowboy. This is just, mucho machismo. So here's a, little rundown of the major ethnic groups and where they live. The mestizos, a mix of Native American, European, and Mexico, Chile, and Colombia. Natives in Guatemala, Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador. Black African, Brazil, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Jamaica. Mostly Europeans in Argentina, Uruguay, and Costa Rica. These two countries are actually the most white in the entire world, and Indian and Trinidad. So if you wonder why did North America did industrialize, but Latin America did it, well, first of all, you understand that England started the Industrial Revolution, so it was natural that British North America would follow. Also, the British North America's experience with self-government and self-government that was allowed by Great Britain. This led to stability versus serial coups. You also had respect for merchants and also the idea of limited government glorious revolution. Also, North America is not sustainable for plantations except for the American South. Thus, this whole, Creole, land of the elite thing really did arise in the British North America. Unless, of course, again, you're talking about the American South. Family settlers led to a bigger Euro-American population, so it's less hierarchical, except, of course, in the southern USA. And also the UK saw French English Canada as us by the 1840s. You also get dependence theory, core periphery, and new nations problems.